today we're going to be working with key features of functions, and those ideas include x-intercepts, y-intercepts, maximums, minimums, and intervals of increase and decrease. So let's start with maximums and minimums, and we're going to look at these three different ways: graphically, looking at a table, and looking at an equation. So let's start with graphically. And the way I like to think about maximums really is just thinking about a mountain, and with a minimum I like to think about a valley. So with a maximum we're looking at this mountain and we're looking at the highest peak here. So the highest peak in this one is going to be up here at the top, and you can imagine yourself, up there at the top of the mountain. So this is going to be our maximum point, and since we are looking at the height, we're looking at which one is the tallest. We're going to be looking at only the y value here, so sort of measuring it like a ruler. So this maximum is going to be at the y value of 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is going to have a maximum of 4. Okay, so now let's look at a table, and with a table we're doing the same thing, and since we are measuring the height, that is actually the y value here. So looking at the table, we're going to look at the largest y value. And we can see that the largest y value is occurring at not 2, not 6, not 1, but at 7. So since it's occurring at 7, we could say it's occurring at the point -1, 7, or we could say the maximum is at 7. Okay, so we could say this one has a max of 4, or we could say it as a coordinate. So the maximum is at 2, 4. Same thing with the table. So we could say this has a max of 7, or we could say that the maximum is at -1, 7. So we could use it as a coordinate, or we could use it as a y value here. All right, so now let's look at the equation. And instead of trying to figure out algebraically what the maximum or minimum is, what we're going to do is utilize our resource of Desmos. So let's go over to Desmos, and we're just going to type in this equation. Okay, so we have -3x squared plus 12x plus 2. And again, we're going to be looking at the maximum point, so that is if we're looking at a mountain. So here is our lovely mountain, and the maximum is occurring up here. Since we are looking for the height, we're only going to be using the y value, so this is going to have a maximum of 14, or we could say the maximum is at 214, the coordinate. So this one has a max of, and let me just make sure what it was. It has a maximum of 14, or we could say the maximum is at 214. Okay, so let's move on to our minimums. And just like with maximums, I said it was a mountain. With minimums, we're going to think about a valley. So we want the very lowest point on this graph, and the lowest point is occurring right here. And since we are looking at how low it's going, we want to see, we're looking at it on the y-axis. So we're not really worried about the x-axis here. We just want to see how low is it going. So only looking at up and down. So here this is going down, and its minimum is going to be a minimum of -1, because that's going down to -1. Or we could say that the minimum is occurring at -3, -1. Okay, so two different ways of saying it. We could say that the minimum is -1, or we could say that the minimum is occurring at the coordinate -3, -1. So let's look at the table. And again, we're only worried about how low it's going, so we're only looking at the y values here. And we can see that the lowest value that we have, the most negative value, is -6. So this minimum is occurring at 1, -6, or we could say the minimum is -6. So min of -6, or we could say that it's occurring at 1, -6. Okay, and then with the equation, we're going to do the same thing that we did before, so we're going to go type that into Desmos. So we have x squared plus 5x plus 7, and we're going to be clicking on this minimum point. So Desmos does show you all the important points here. We can see actually the y-intercept, and we can see the minimum here. So this minimum is occurring at a strange point, but let's not be scared by this point. So we're only looking at the y value. So this has a minimum. Oh, you can't see what I'm writing. This has a minimum of, and the y value was 0.75. Or we could say that this minimum was occurring at the coordinate. So let's look at the coordinate, which was negative 2.5, 0.75. Okay, so let's move on to our little bubble down here. So one thing that I was saying before is that maximums and minimums can be written as y values. They can be written as x values, but that's not going to be happening very often, or they can be written as coordinates. So I'm just going to highlight y values here because that is going to be our main thing that we're going to use. X values is not really going to occur very often. We can say that it's happening at the x value of -3, for example, but that's not necessarily going to be something that would be asked of you. Most of the time it's going to be y values or coordinates.